transmission. Place some transmission assembly lube onto the rear case bushing. Rotate the transmission so it is in a vertical position. Install new seals on the low reverse piston. Lubricate the seals with transmission assembly lube. The low reverse piston has a cutout that must be lined up with the parking pawl. Note where the parking pawl is before installing this into the case. Install the piston into the case and push it down into place. Verify that the parking pawl will engage through the low reverse clutch piston. Install the low reverse clutch return spring into the case over the piston. Install the low reverse clutch spring compressor into the case and slowly compress the clutch spring. Install the snap ring. Verify the snap ring is fully seated and remove the clutch spring compressor. Install the rear case thrust bearing and install the reaction ring gear. Place a small amount of assembly lube onto the reaction carrier and install the correct thrust bearing. Install the reaction carrier down into the transmission, making sure the planets line up with the ring gear. Install the case anti-clunk spring into the transmission case in the correct position. Place your new frictions in a pan of the correct automatic transmission fluid and let them soak for at least 15 minutes. Now, install the low reverse clutch wave washer. The wave washer looks like a steel, but it is slightly bent. Our steels and our wave washer will have a notch cut out of one of the tabs to identify where it goes. This makes the installation process go slightly quicker. Install the steel down into the splines of the case. Install your selective fit plate, a friction, followed by a steel and another friction. Continue alternating frictions and steels until you have installed the clutch pack. Install the low reverse one-way roller into the case. Make sure the splines of the one-way roller line up with the planetary carrier. Install the snap ring down into the outside edge of the case. Make sure the snap ring is fully seated in the groove. Rotate the transmission. Apply compressed air to the oil inlet hole for the low reverse clutch and verify the proper operation. Install the output shaft into the transmission, making sure that the splines line up with the reaction ring gear. Install the output shaft support tool onto the back of the transmission case. Rotate the transmission so it is vertical once again. Lubricate the plastic thrust washer with some transmission assembly lube and install it down onto the one-way roller. Install the reaction sun gear into the transmission, making sure the teeth line up with the planetary gears. Install the sun shell into the transmission, making sure it lines up with the splines on the sun. Lubricate the shell thrust washer with some transmission assembly lube and place it down into the shell, making sure the tabs line up with the holes in the shell. Install the input ring gear into the transmission, making sure all the splines line up properly and it drops into place. Install the correct thrust bearing onto the back of the input planetary carrier and install it into the transmission. Make sure the planetary gears line up and slide all the way in. Install a new snap ring down onto the output shaft. Make sure the snap ring seats completely. Make sure the correct select fit washer is installed on the input shaft assembly. Install the correct thrust washer over the input shaft and down into the input shaft assembly. If your input shaft seals were not lubricated when they were replaced, Make sure and apply some transmission assembly lube to them now. Install the low reverse input drum onto the input shaft assembly. Wiggle and shake until all the clutches line up and the drum is fully seated. Place the entire input shaft assembly into the transmission case. We're going to shake the input shaft until all the frictions line up properly and drop into place. To determine if the input shaft is installed properly, lift up slightly on the input shaft and lower it down. There will be a solid clunk as it's set down if it is installed correctly. This is the sound it will make if it is not fully seated. Soak the new band in a pan of the correct transmission fluid for at least 15 minutes. Install the band down into the case in its correct position. Line the anchor side of the band up with the anchor pin hole. Install the anchor pin through the case and into the band. Make sure the anchor pin is engaged properly with the band. Install a new pump gasket in the correct direction into the transmission case, making sure that all the holes line up properly. If the stator shaft seals were not lubricated while installing the new seals, lubricate them now with some transmission assembly lube. Place some transmission assembly lube on the back of the thrust washer to help hold it in place, and install the thrust washer onto the back of the pump. Lubricate the face of the thrust washer with some transmission assembly lube. Place the pump over the input shaft and line up the bolt holes as you lower the pump down into place. Each of the pump bolts will have an O-ring installed under the head of the bolt that must be removed and replaced. Install a new O-ring on each of the bolts, and install a small dab of transmission assembly lube to the bolt hole. This will help prevent ripping the seal while torquing the bolt. Install the bolts into place. Run the bolts down evenly. Once all the bolts are run down so that they are touching the pump, torque in a crisscross pattern, tightening each bolt a few turns to pull the pump into the case. Once the pump is fully seated, go ahead and torque the bolts to 18 foot-pounds on this particular transmission. Make sure your input shaft still spins. If it does not, something is installed incorrectly. The pump must be removed. Install a dial indicator onto the end of the input shaft of the transmission, and perform an end play measurement to make sure you are within specifications. If it's not within specifications, the transmission will have to come back apart. Remove the old gaskets from your valve body spacer plate. One of the gaskets will be labeled with a C. The other one will be labeled with a V. The C stands for the case side gasket, and the V stands for the valve body side gasket. Compare your old gasket to the new gasket, and make sure that they are the same. Transmission kits will often come with several different valve body gaskets. Install the gasket down onto the transmission case. Install the accumulator spring. Make sure you install new filters onto the spacer plate. Install the spacer plate, making sure that the holes line up. Next, install your gasket to the valve body. Install the valve body spacer plate support plate onto the rear of the spacer plate, making sure that all the gasket holes line up properly. Leave the bolts finger tight for now. Install your rebuilt accumulator onto the spacer plate and install the bolts. There are several different length bolts that are used in this transmission. Always consult the service information for where the correct length bolts go, and torque the bolts to the manufacturer's specification. Now torque the support plate to specification. Install the rooster comb and parking pawl actuator linkage into the transmission. Place the selector shaft through the outside of the case and through the rooster comb. Install the nut onto the back side of the selector shaft, but leave it loose at this time. Apply some transmission assembly lube to the bottom of the valve body, where the check balls need to go. The transmission assembly lube will help hold the check ball in place. Install the check balls into the correct position. Insert the manual valve into the valve body, leaving a portion of the valve exposed. Install the manual valve linkage into the manual valve and carefully position it, and hook it into the rooster comb.
It's a long video.
Place the valve body down onto the transmission case, making sure that the holes line up. There are several different length bolts for this valve body. Begin installing the bolts into the correct holes, but do not tighten them yet. Install your new or rebuilt pressure switch onto the valve body, and install the correct bolts. The valve body bolts must be torqued in sequence to the correct torque specification. Tighten up the rooster comb nut appropriately. Make sure the rooster comb engages with the flats on the selector shaft, and install the clip onto the selector shaft. Install the detent roller onto the rooster comb. Install the wiring harness onto the valve body, and install the torque converter clutch solenoid into the front pump. Install the bolts that hold the torque converter clutch solenoid in place.
Package?
Make sure to install the dipstick stop into the correct bolt hole.
Yeah.
Torque the bolts to specification. Install the torque converter clutch pulse width modulation solenoid into the valve body and install the retaining clip. Collect all the electrical connectors to the solenoids, pressure switches, and temperature sensor. Rotate the transmission so the input shaft is vertical. If the seal retainer was not installed previously, install it onto the front of the front pump. Install the bell housing onto the front of the transmission, making sure that the bolt holes line up. Install all the bolt holes into the housing and torque the bolts to specification. Rotate the transmission back down. Install a new filter into the front pump. Install a new pan gasket. Install the transmission pan. Start all the bolts before tightening down any of the bolts. Make sure the gasket lines up through the bolt holes and torque the bolts to specification. Install a new gasket onto the extension housing and install the extension housing onto the transmission. Install the bolts and torque to specification. Install the rebuilt servo assembly into the servo bore.
What?
Install the servo cover with the compression tool.
Thank you. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
With the tool installed, tighten
it's
up
probably
the
the
servo compression
headlights or
tool to
taillights
compress
for
the
the
servo
motorcycle.
cover and springs. Install the servo snap ring into the snap ring groove. Make sure it snaps into place. And loosen up the servo compression tool. Remove the tool from the transmission and reinstall the transmission pan bolt. Install the output shaft speed sensor into the extension housing. Install the bolt and torque to specifications. Install a small amount of thread sealant onto the threads of the pressure tap. Install the pressure tap into the transmission and tighten up the tap appropriately. Install the manual lever position sensor and neutral safety switch onto the manual shaft and install the bolts loosely. Adjust the manual lever sensor by making sure the transmission is in park and place an ohm meter on the correct terminals in the switch. Rotate the sensor until the resistance is correct and tighten the bolts down. This concludes the reassembly of our 4L60E transmission.